What a pleasure it is to be here before a group such as you, people who represent the people self-consciously to defend our rights from government. That's what it's all about, and I know about some of you, and you've been doing that, and I salute you, because I know you don't even always, maybe never, have the support of your own county commissioners when you get involved in pushing back against illegitimate exercise, unconstitutional exercise of power. What you're fighting, what we're fighting, is a mentality of the ruling class. And having been in the legislature, I experienced how contagious that mentality can be. And if it weren't for my wife yelling at the other end of a phone for me to get some sense in my head, I probably would have fallen all the way into the mentality. We're born to rule and you're born to be ruled is the essential attitude that we see personified in our president, but all too many other public officials as well. And if it weren't for you, that ruling class mentality would have totally taken over. I guess there's it's an international problem. I was having a debate with a British parliamentarian on CNN International, and I explained to him that the gun control law back in '96 that they were about to enact in Great Britain was only going to do one thing. It was going to produce an increase of crime and violent crime. We'd seen the effects of that in our country, and the opposite, that when people were enabled to carry guns more freely, or the 4 states that now have constitutional carry, no permits required at all, crime goes down, never goes up. And he said, "Oh, I say, anybody who would say that over here, we'd say he's quite flaky." I said, "I know you would. That's why we're no longer British." But apparently there are folks in Washington that would like to still be under that same system. And maybe they think that we've elected a George III. Well, we have news for them. Not in your county, for sure. And that's, I think, the way we're going to see our way out of this mess, is when there's been enough nullification of federal tomfoolery, then it will fall of its own weight. But it takes the guts that you all have brought to the table to make it happen. We're making some progress. The state level particularly has been encouraging. More and more states are enacting more and more liberty to carry firearms concealed, which is something that even in my state of Virginia is now on the table for a constitutional carry measure. And I'm hopeful that many more states will be added to the list in this legislative season this year. The battle against zero care, I like to call it, Obamacare, is one that involves gun owners. I don't know if that had been brought to your attention, but the fact of the matter is it requires that all of our personal records, including medical records, be accessible to federal drones to troll through them. And that means they could compile their central data file on gun owners just like that. They have no idea, no concept at all of privacy. The nullification movement is represented ably by the state of Wyoming. They passed a Firearms Freedom Act, and I'm sure most of you know what those acts are. 6 states have them, and it says that if you have made a gun in the state and it stays in the state, no federal firearms laws apply whatsoever. This really blows up the bureaucrats' heads because, why, there's no regulation then. There's no licensing. There's no background checks. Yeah, kind of like the way it used to be when crime was lower. So Wyoming went one step further. They almost got it totally right. They said it's a 365-day crime with jail time, of course, if you impose federal law against state law. Well, if they'd made it 366 days, and I'm hopeful that they might, I've brought it to their attention, they might do that, then it becomes an offense with a long enough potential jail sentence to deprive that federal agent of his gun rights under federal law. He's no longer a federal agent. Are you feeling lucky? Thank you, Wyoming. That was really a good move. I was just down in New Mexico, and I saw some things that were exciting to me. I met with Sheriff Benny Hughes of Otero County on the Mexican border, and the county commissioners had decided that the village on top of the mountains, Cloudcroft, in the midst of a national forest, was in danger of being consumed if a forest fire were to come raging along. It was very dry this year. And so they enacted a measure that said that an 80,000 acre swath could be cut around Cloudcroft to protect it in the event of a fire. And the Forest Service said, anybody tries to do that and we'll arrest them. And the sheriff of the county, Mr. Hughes, said, if you arrest any of them, I'm arresting you. That was back in August, and I hear there's a lot of firewood for sale up there in Cloudcroft. This is something that has, I don't know, given me a lot of encouragement to think that one man would be able to stand and make something like this happen. In the county north, in Lincoln County, the man that's almost certain to be the next sheriff, Robert Schaefer, has told me at a meeting that I had with him that yeah, it would be a good idea. I think I'll do that. Namely, train his officers, his deputies, alongside men in the militia in the county who are totally supportive of the now under sheriff. And the idea that all of a sudden he goes from 35 deputies to 235 deputies at no expense is kind of neat. And I thought, yeah, I want to share that, this is something that hopefully can be done. I know that your colleague from Eaton County, Michigan, Mike Raines, has done something similar when people come in and pick up their concealed carry permit, because that's where they get it from. He's the final issuing authority. He invites them to join his Guardians of the Constitution. We wouldn't want to call it a militia, but the Guardians of the Constitution, and they're available if there's some kind of an emergency. He's got a lot of depth to his bench. It's an excellent idea. The invasiveness of our government at the national level, and to perhaps some extent at the state level as well, is becoming a threat that I think is going to require more and more support to oppose from you all. The National Defense Authorization Act says that any covered person, which is not defined, so that could be really anybody who's accused of being a potential terrorist, can be arrested by the military without warrant, detained indefinitely, period, paragraph. We're going to need your help, guys. That's outrageous. That's what King George was doing. The writs of assistance that they could just put up on the shelf, and anytime they wanted to arrest that loudmouth Larry Pratt, they just come over and get him, shut him up. We're back to that point again. They would probably consider you parts of the terroristic threat in this country, because you all support the Constitution, and that's a crazy idea that has to be suppressed. The gentleman that invited me down to New Mexico and arranged the series of meetings that I had was one of our members, Dr. Ray Seidel. He told me of a friend of his who rode his bicycle from up in the mountains down about, well, at the speed limit, it's about a 3-hour drive to El Paso. Fellow that he'd loaned money to was ready to pay him back, so he rode down to pick up about $3,000, and it was in cash. When he came up to this Border Patrol checkpoint, some 25 miles north of the border, what an outrage that is. We saw earlier on that map that they think that there's 100 miles from the border that's Constitution free. And so this motorcycle rider was pulled over when he went through this checkpoint. And they said, where you been? He said, why you want to know? I said, well, When you went through, you had $36 in your pocket. Now you've got $3,036. What'd you do? Can you imagine that kind of surveillance equipment being used against our citizens? I'd like to know that much information about those officers at that checkpoint. What about them? What about their checking account? What kind of activity are they engaged in, huh? This is just outrageous that our employees are treating us as if we were their property. We need your help to stop that. Let's make sure I've got everything here, and then I'll let them catch up with time. Oh, yes. One way we can combat this growing problem is to address the educational deficit of our country caused by our government schools. They are not teaching the Constitution. And I'm happy to say that my son, Eric, has written a book called Constitutional Recipe for Freedom, and it's at principlesoffreedom.com. It's a textbook that he uses with an online homeschool teaching organization called the Potter School, and he walks the students through the Constitution, what the founders had in mind, the biblical principles that they were employing with their own words, and the impact has been enormous. One of his students, she is an evangelical Christian, but she was in New York City, and bless her heart, she was just an uber liberal along with her parents. At the end of the course, not only had he won her over on the gun issue, which is what happens frequently when kids come in and take the class, but she then started arguing with her mom on their whole liberal worldview. He had transformed her just by walking her through what made this country so great, what made it so free, what made it so prosperous. So principlesoffreedom.com is a tool that you could make available to people, direct people to, so that they can find out what are their rights. When some crat from Washington tells them you can't do something with your land, you say, well, what authority do you have to tell me that? Well, where is that in the Constitution? And sometimes that's enough to back people off. Dr. Seidel, after dropping me off, was pulled over at that same checkpoint. And they pulled him aside. Eventually had about 5 officers around his car. And finally, after about a 4-minute, he said, discussion back and forth with them, he said, by what constitutional authority are you detaining me? Well, we're not detaining you, you're free to go. And he drove off. It was the invocation of the word constitutional that caused them to see the light. We've got to use that tool the founders gave us. Thank you guys and gals for being the ones who are leading the way in this, and I'm hopeful that your number will be double this magnificent number the next time Richie Mack puts this event together. Thank you so much for being here.